The film begins by introducing a family who have just moved into their new home. The house is enormous and still filled with moving boxes since they have not completely finished unpacking. The family consists of Keira, Brian, their teenage daughter Ellie, and her younger brother Steven. Unlike Steven, who is excited about living in a much bigger house, Ellie is far from happy about the move. In her eyes, the new house is too far away from her, forcing her to leave behind the life she has always known. As she starts exploring the house, Ellie notices several strange things left behind by the previous owner. Besides being filled with old paintings, nearly every door in the house bears mysterious symbols with triangular markings beneath them. When Ellie asks why none of these things have been removed, Keira explains that they have only just moved in and have not had time to sort everything out yet, although most of the items will probably be thrown away eventually. Ellie's uneasiness grows even stronger when she decides to check out the basement. The space is dark, spacious, and carries an unsettling atmosphere that makes anyone reluctant to stay there for long. While Ellie is inside, the basement door suddenly slams shut on its own. At first she assumes her family is playing a prank on her, but her panic quickly escalates when Brian is unable to open the door from the outside. Terrified, Ellie begins to feel as though something is watching her from the darkness. Fortunately, Brian eventually finds a key hanging on the wall and manages to unlock the door, allowing her to get out. The incident leaves Ellie convinced that something is wrong with their new home. Back in her room, she chooses to be alone. Not long afterward, Keira comes to check on her daughter and make sure she is okay. As a teenager going through a rebellious phase, Ellie is often sensitive and quick to become irritated. Keira tries to talk with her and even tells her about a work project she is currently involved in, but Ellie shows no interest at all. She even openly admits that she dislikes her mother's job. Before leaving, Keira asks Ellie to watch over Steven that evening because she and Brian will be working late. Although reluctant, Ellie eventually agrees. Before her parents leave, she once again questions why they had to move into this house. Keira explains that everything is being done for the family's future, but the answer does little to satisfy her. Later that night, Keira and Brian leave for work while Ellie and Steven stay home alone. Missing her friends, Ellie spends some time talking to one of them on the phone. At the moment, without her noticing, the door directly behind her slowly opens by itself. A short while later, Steven suddenly appears wearing a skull mask and successfully startles his sister. After being scolded, Steven shows Ellie where he found the mask. It turns out he discovered it inside a cabinet located in the playroom. The inside of the cabinet is dark, dusty, and covered in cobwebs. Their attention is then drawn to an old gramophone that surprisingly still works perfectly. When Ellie plays it, they hear the recorded voice of a man reciting a strange mathematical formula before slowly beginning to count numbers. Oddly enough, every time the counting can be heard, the electricity throughout the house starts behaving strangely. Feeling that something is wrong, Ellie quickly stops the recording before the counting reaches its end. Written on the record itself is a name along with the same mathematical formula that the mysterious voice had just recited. Although slightly disturbed by it, Ellie chooses to ignore the discovery and spends the rest of the evening watching television alone in the living room. Unbeknownst to her, a cold draft begins to flow from beneath the basement door. Not long afterward, the lights start flickering, electrical devices begin shutting off by themselves, and eventually even the television she is watching suddenly goes dark. Panicked, Ellie immediately calls Keira and tells her that all the power in the house has suddenly gone out. Assuming it is nothing more than an electrical issue, Keira asks her daughter to check the circuit breaker located in the basement. Ellie immediately refuses, still shaken by the experience of being trapped down there earlier. However, Keira continues reassuring her and promises to stay on the phone the entire time. Thinking about Steven, who might wake up frightened in the dark, Ellie finally gathers enough courage to enter the basement once again. Armed with nothing but a candle for light, she slowly descends the stairs into the pitch-black basement. To help calm her down, Keira suggests that she count each step as she goes. There are only 10 steps leading down to the basement. At first, everything seems normal as Ellie carefully counts her way down, but the moment she reaches the 10th step, something strange happens. Her body suddenly collapses as if she has lost consciousness. Yet through the phone call, Keira can still hear her daughter's voice continuing to count numbers without stopping, even though the staircase only has 10 steps. What makes the situation even more disturbing is that Ellie no longer responds whenever Keira calls her name. Sensing that something is terribly wrong, Keira and Brian immediately leave work and rush home. Upon arriving, they head straight for the basement, but Ellie is nowhere to be found. There are no signs of a struggle and no clues indicating where she might have gone. It is as if she has simply vanished into thin air. The police are quickly contacted and a large search operation begins throughout the surrounding area, but nothing turns up. Brian tries to convince Keira that Ellie probably ran away because she was unhappy about moving into the new house, especially since she had run away from home before. However, Keira refuses to believe that explanation. She cannot shake the feeling that Ellie's disappearance is somehow connected to whatever happened in the basement that night. Days pass without any sign of Ellie. Search teams continue looking for clues while Keira becomes consumed by guilt, blaming herself for telling Ellie to go down to the basement. Although Brian constantly tries to comfort her and insists that Ellie is probably staying with one of her friends, Keira cannot accept that possibility. Her instincts tell her that her daughter disappeared the moment she entered the basement. Unwilling to sit around and wait, Keira begins conducting her own investigation. She puts up missing person posters all over town, visits the police station almost every day, and contacts anyone who might have interacted with Ellie. Despite all her efforts, nothing leads to any answers. The police question Ellie's friends, examine her social media activity, and review security footage from around the neighborhood, but they fail to uncover any useful clues. Even after learning that Ellie had been the target of online bullying, Keira remains convinced that it has nothing to do with her disappearance. Back at home, Keira notices a strange phrase written above the front door, "Solve et coagula." After researching its meaning, she learns that it roughly translates to the idea that something must first be broken down before it can be rebuilt. At the same time, she tries to retrace the events of the night Ellie vanished. That is why she asks Stephen whether anything unusual happened before Ellie disappeared. Stephen tells her about the old gramophone they found and briefly played together. At the time, Keira does not consider the information particularly important. Instead, she decides to investigate the basement again because her instincts keep telling her that the answer to everything lies there. Carrying an ultraviolet flashlight, Keira carefully examines the basement once more. She is shocked to discover that each step leading down to the basement is numbered from 1 to 10, while a strange mathematical formula has been carved into the floor below. Even more disturbing, the basement walls are covered with frightening drawings that only become visible under ultraviolet light. Although the police dismiss them as meaningless images unrelated to Ellie's disappearance, Keira becomes increasingly convinced that the house is hiding a dark secret. The police ask Brian and Keira where they purchased the property, and Brian explains that they bought the house at an auction for an unusually low price. Later that night, after helping Stephen get back to sleep, Keira is awakened by a faint whispering sound. As she follows the noise, she realizes it sounds like someone quietly counting numbers. The mysterious counting leads her through the house until she unknowingly finds herself standing outside the basement door. In the process, she accidentally kicks a ball that rolls down into the darkness below. Strangely, the counting immediately stops. When she turns on the basement lights, the ball is nowhere to be found. Instead, her attention is once again drawn to the mathematical formula carved into the basement floor. For the first time, Keira begins to suspect that all the strange symbols, numbers, and unsettling events happening inside the house may somehow be connected. The following day, Keira begins paying closer attention to the strange symbols placed above every doorway and asks Brian whether he knows what they mean. However, Brian cannot provide any answers and believes that Keira is reading too much into the symbols and connecting them to Ellie's disappearance. Even so, Keira decides to trust her instincts. She contacts the auction agent who sold them the house and requests information about the previous owner. Unfortunately, the agent does not have the complete records available and asks for some time to gather the information. Unwilling to simply wait, Keira photographs every symbol throughout the house and asks one of her coworkers to help investigate their meaning. Although she attends an important meeting that day, her thoughts remain consumed by Ellie's disappearance, making it difficult for her to focus. Before leaving work, Her coworker finally discovers something interesting. The symbols turn out to be Hebrew letters. Individually, they do not appear to have any clear meaning, but when arranged together, they form a single name, Leviathan. On her way to pick up Stephen from school, Keira cannot stop thinking about that name. When she arrives, she learns that Stephen has gotten into a fight. One of his classmates had claimed that Ellie was dead, and Stephen became so upset that he ended up fighting back. After returning home, Keira begins researching Leviathan. From what she finds, the name is often associated with a giant creature from ancient legends. However, the more she learns, the more curious she becomes about the house they now live in. Her thoughts soon return to the old gramophone that Ellie and Stephen had played shortly before Ellie disappeared. Believing that it might hold an important clue, Keira decides to play the record once again. Not long after it starts, the mysterious male voice can be heard reciting the same mathematical formula before slowly counting numbers. At the very same moment, without Keira noticing, objects throughout the playroom begin moving on their own and the cabinet door slowly creaks open. Stephen, who is inside the room, appears to fall into a trance. He slowly walks toward the cabinet while repeating the numbers coming from the gramophone. The moment Keira hears Stephen counting, she immediately stops the recording. Instantly, Stephen snaps back to reality and looks confused, unable to remember what had just happened. The incident convinces Keira even more that the gramophone is somehow connected to the strange events surrounding her family. While examining one of the paintings left behind by the previous owner, Keira finally discovers the identity of the man portrayed in it. His name is John Featherston. After researching him, she uncovers a shocking fact. John was a physicist who mysteriously disappeared years ago. Even more disturbing, it was not only John who vanished, but nearly his entire family as well. All of it happened inside the very house where Keira and her family now live. Only one member of John's family is known to have survived, his youngest daughter Rose Featherston. That night, strange events begin occurring once again. The basement door suddenly swings open by itself while the lights throughout the house start shutting off one by one, just as they did on the night Ellie disappeared. Within seconds, the entire house is plunged into darkness. In the middle of the unsettling silence, Keira hears Stephen calling for help from behind the locked basement door. Panicking, she desperately tries to open it but fails. Stephen's voice continues coming from inside while the key has mysteriously vanished. When she peeks through the keyhole, she sees a figure that is clearly not human. Strangely, moments later, Stephen suddenly appears behind her completely unharmed. That can only mean the voice coming from behind the basement door did not belong to Stephen at all. A short time later, the basement door opens on its own and the electricity throughout the house suddenly returns as if nothing had happened. The basement key, which had previously disappeared, inexplicably reappears on the floor. Keira immediately hangs it back on the wall. Convinced that the house is hiding something, she gathers her courage and decides to enter the basement alone in search of answers. However, the moment she steps inside, the basement door slams shut behind her and traps her once again. Her phone, which is her only source of light, falls to the ground after a sudden gust of wind startles her. Panic begins to set in as she hears growling noises and faint footsteps approaching from somewhere within the darkness. Meanwhile, Stephen struggles to reach the basement key from outside, but even after obtaining it, he is unable to unlock the door. Fortunately, Brian arrives home just in time and manages to open it. Although Keira tells him everything she experienced, Brian finds it difficult to believe her. To him, these incidents are probably the result of the emotional stress caused by Ellie's disappearance. But Keira refuses to let the matter go. She asks Brian to go down into the basement and look for the phone she dropped, hoping he will finally see that something is seriously wrong with the place. While searching, Brian never finds the missing phone. Instead, he discovers a strange clump of hair that should not be there. For a brief moment, he even thinks he sees something moving within the darkness. Nevertheless, Brian chooses to ignore it and continues convincing himself that all of these events are nothing more than coincidences. The following day, Keira visits a university and meets a mathematics professor named Remy. She shows him the formula she discovered in the basement and hopes he can explain what is really happening. Inside their house, after examining the formula, Remy immediately realizes that it is highly unusual. According to him, the equation is far more complex than ordinary mathematical formulas and likely carries a meaning far beyond simple calculations. When Keira mentions the name John Featherston, Remy instantly recognizes it because the office he now occupies once belonged to John before his mysterious disappearance years ago. Although fascinated by Keira's discovery, Remy explains that he needs time to study the formula more thoroughly before he can provide any definitive answers. After returning home, Keira tries to go about her day as normally as possible. Not long afterward, Remy contacts her again and reveals that he had repeatedly tried calling her phone number. Keira explains that her old phone mysteriously disappeared in the basement, forcing her to buy a new device and reactivate the same number. However, what unsettles Remy is the fact that before Keira resumed using the number, someone had apparently answered one of his calls. Strangely, there was no conversation on the other. The only thing he heard was someone endlessly counting numbers. Remy then shares the results of his research. After consulting with several colleagues in France, he discovers that the same formula once appeared in a similar case involving an old house in Belgium. Even more disturbing, every resident of that house vanished without a trace. Their investigation reveals that the formula dates back to the 15th century and was supposedly created by an alchemist. Although its true purpose remains unclear, the formula appears to be connected to theories involving travel between dimensions. Hearing this, Keira becomes even more convinced that Ellie's disappearance was not an ordinary event. She then shows Brian the symbols found throughout the house and explains that they spell out the name Leviathan. However, she still has no idea what the triangles beneath each symbol represent. Just as before, Brian believes she is stretching things too far by linking mythology to their daughter's disappearance. Hoping to convince him, Keira takes Brian back to the basement and shows him the numbers carved into each step as well as mathematical formula etched into the floor. Even then, Brian remains skeptical. While they argue, another strange event unfolds in the playroom. The cabinet door suddenly swings open by itself. Curious, Steven slowly approaches and notices that the inside of the cabinet now appears far darker and much deeper than before. At the same time, an irritated Brian attempts to destroy the mathematical formula in the basement by striking it. Instead of breaking apart, the floor emits a strange metallic humming sound as if something beneath it is resonating. At that exact moment, the old gramophone in another room suddenly begins playing on its own. John Featherston's recorded voice can once again be heard reciting the same mathematical formula before continuing with a sequence of numbers. As the counting echoes throughout the house, Steven, who is standing in front of the cabinet, sees a figure emerging from the darkness within. He immediately recognizes the person as Ellie. Terrified, Steven screams for his parents. Keira and Brian rush to his side, but by the time they arrive, the figure has vanished without a trace. Curiously, every strange phenomenon comes to an abrupt stop the moment the counting on the recording reaches the number 10. Though they do not find Ellie, Brian discovers Ellie's phone near the cabinet. That discovery finally convinces him that something is genuinely wrong with the house. For the first time, he can no longer dismiss everything as a coincidence. Searching for more answers, Keira decides to visit the only surviving member of the Featherston family, Rose Featherston, John Featherston's daughter, who now lives in a nursing home. The moment Rose learns that Keira is living in her former house and has lost a child, her demeanor changes noticeably. When Keira asks her to explain what really happened, the elderly woman writes down only a single name, Leviathan. Rose goes on to explain that her father was once a highly respected scientist. However, everything changed when one of his family members became seriously ill. Desperate for answers, John began searching beyond the limits of science and gradually became obsessed with something he called Leviathan. According to Rose, the problem is not limited to the basement. The entire house is affected. On her way home, Keira tries calling Remy to discuss her latest discovery. Once again, the only thing she hears on the phone is the sound of someone endlessly counting numbers. Meanwhile, Brian, who is finally beginning to believe his wife's suspicions, continues studying the symbols scattered throughout the house. After arranging the triangles found beneath each symbol, he realizes that together they form a pentagram. When Keira arrives home, Brian shows her what he has discovered. The symbol turns out to be the sigil of Baphomet, an emblem often associated with the worship of ancient entities. What makes the discovery even more unsettling is that the hand gesture used by Baphomet closely resembles the pose seen in John Thurston's portrait hanging inside the house. Even the phrase Salvet Coagula, carved above the entrance, appears to be connected to Baphomet as well. Meanwhile, Stephen is playing with his drone inside the house when it suddenly loses control and flies on its own toward the basement. Unaware of the danger waiting for him, Stephen slowly follows it downstairs. At the same time, Keira decides to play John Thurston's record once again in hopes of finding more clues. Just like before, the recording begins with John's voice reciting a strange mathematical formula before slowly counting numbers. Without anyone realizing it, the counting once again begins to affect Stephen, who is now in the basement. Just as it happened to Ellie, Stephen gradually loses awareness and starts walking down the basement stairs while following the numbers coming from the recording. When he reaches the bottom, Stephen briefly regains his senses and manages to recover his drone. However, standing right beside him is Baphomet. Seconds later, the entire house loses power once again, followed by Stephen's terrified scream, causing Keira and Brian to rush toward the basement. Unfortunately, by the time they arrive, Stephen has vanished, leaving only his drone lying on the floor. Keira immediately fears that Stephen may have suffered the same fate as Ellie. In the middle of the panic, a ball suddenly appears. Keira instantly recognizes it is the same ball she accidentally kicked into the basement earlier. Moments later, they hear someone counting numbers. Following the sound, they discover Stephen walking inside the cabinet, which now appears far darker and much larger than before. After bringing him back out, they realize that his body is burning hot. When they remove his shirt, they find a pentagram-shaped symbol carved into his chest. In a trance-like state, Stephen claims that he has just ridden a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns before continuing to count numbers again. Growing more alarmed, Keira searches for Brian, who has suddenly disappeared. She eventually finds him in a similar condition. Brian has also started counting numbers unconsciously, as though he's fallen under the same influence that previously affected Stephen and Ellie. Before long, Brian's counting turns into a countdown. When it reaches the final number, something in the basement begins moving closer. Keira suddenly comes face to face with Baphomet. With nowhere else to run, she rushes into the basement. However, she discovers that the staircase, which normally consists of only 10 steps, has transformed into a seemingly endless passageway. Realizing that Baphomet is following behind her, Keira has no choice but to keep descending until she reaches a place unlike anything she has ever seen before. There she finds a dark and vast world filled with thousands, perhaps millions, of people from different worlds. The only way to all of them stand in enormous lines while endlessly counting numbers in countless different languages. In that place, Keira finally begins to understand what has been happening all along. The mathematical formula carved into the basement floor, the strange symbols scattered throughout the house, the numbers engraved on the staircase, and John Thurston's recording are all connected. It appears that John Thurston somehow discovered a way to open a path to another world. Rather than using traditional rituals commonly found in horror stories, he relied on a combination of mathematical formulas and numerical sequences preserved within his recording. Every time the record is played, anyone who hears it gradually falls under its influence and begins repeating the numbers without realizing it. The basement is the most important part of the process. It is not simply a basement, but a doorway connecting the human world to another dimension. Once someone influenced by the recording continues following the numbers while entering the basement, the boundary between the two worlds slowly begins to open. Keira finally understands what happened to Ellie. On the night of the blackout, Ellie heard John's recording and descended into the basement while counting the steps exactly as her mother had instructed. However, after reaching the 10th and final step, the counting continued even though there were no more stairs left to descend. Without realizing it, Ellie had crossed through the doorway and entered the world hidden beyond the basement. The same thing gradually began happening to Stephen and Brian. The more often the family listened to the recording and the more frequently they interacted with the basement, the stronger the influence of the other world became. Eventually, they no longer realized when they had begun crossing from the human world into another reality. Among the countless people endlessly counting numbers, Keira eventually notices a familiar tattoo. It belongs to Ellie. Fighting her way through the crowd, she finally finds her daughter, who appears dazed and continues repeating numbers just like everyone else. Keira manages to snap Ellie out of her trance and leads her back toward the endless staircase connecting that dimension to their house. During their journey back, Keira can still hear Baphomet's footsteps echoing in the distance. Strangely, the creature makes no attempt to stop them. Although something feels wrong, Keira continues onward until they finally return to the house. Gradually, Ellie begins recovering. Stephen and Brian also regain their senses after falling under the influence of the entity. For a brief moment, Keira believes that the nightmare is finally over. Convinced that the house is the source of all their problems, the family decides to leave immediately. However, when Keira opens the front door, all she sees is an endless staircase stretching into darkness. At that moment, she finally realizes the horrifying truth. They never truly returned to their own world. All this time, they believed that only Ellie had been pulled into another dimension. In reality, every time the recording was played and every time they entered the basement, they too were slowly being drawn into the same place. Keira finally understands why Baphomet never tried to stop her. It was not because they had escaped, but because they were already trapped inside the other world. The house they had been living in was no longer part of the human world at all. It had become part of the other realm connected through the basement. Moments later, Ellie, Stephen, and Brian once again begin counting numbers unconsciously as they slowly walk toward the basement. Keira soon finds herself doing the same, following them while quietly counting the numbers. And with that, the story comes to an end.